Afterman. Sorry about that. He's the head of the Israeli Asia Policy Program at the Abba Evan Institution for International Diplomacy at Reichman University. Dr. Afterman served as the International Strategy Officer at the Australian Foreign Office, where he dealt with issues related to region security and cooperation in Asia. And as a diplomat at the Australian Embassy in Beijing, he was later appointed a research fellow at the International Peace Research Institution in Oslo and led the China program at the Institution for Jewish People's Policy Planning in Jerusalem. Today, Mr. Afterman will speak to us and share from his experience, insights, and unique understanding of the topic of Southeast Asia, geopolitical and diplomatic development throughout the region. Today's event is, of course, being broadcast to all of our global chapters, including Italy, India, Germany, and more. One last thing, in terms of format, we will be doing things a little bit different today. Participants are welcome to ask questions and participate during Dr. Afterman's lecture. You may use the raise hand function on your personal device. This way, Dr. Afterman will see you and see that you are like to speak and will call you that you can participate. Please, when you participate, mention your name and where you're from. And please remember to be respectful and patient, as there are many people that would like to participate, and we'll try to get to all of you. For any problems or other questions, you may send a message on the Zoom chat for any of the crew members. And after the lecture is over, we will, of course, have the option of splitting into break rooms, and participants can communicate and speak with each other about the lecture and whatever they want. And with that, we would like to welcome our guest speaker for today's event, Dr. Gedaliah Afterman. Dr. Afterman, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stav and IDI for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Gedaliah, which is just a little correction, which is a little less archaic than Gedaliah, but nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here. And today, as we said, we'll try and have a bit of a conversation rather than a lecture. I will present with a PowerPoint presentation, but feel free to ask questions or comment. I will try and keep my presentation to about 30 minutes, and then we can open it up to a bit more of a conversation. And again, this should be fairly flexible. Let me just share the screen. Can you see it all right? Yes?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So today's topic, I was asked to talk about Southeast Asia, and I was thinking about what would be what would be the most interesting angle from where I'm standing. As Stav mentioned, I had a program called the Asia Policy Program, which focuses on superpower competition, on the relationship between China and the United States around the world, on the competition between them, and on the role of middle powers, or I would say middle countries that are stuck in between the Middle East, in between China and the United States. In the Middle East is one focus, but I think the most important region in the world for this issue is Southeast Asia. But before we talk about Southeast Asia, let's talk a little bit about Asia, right? As I'm sure you've heard, these days people talk about the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, and this is quite political, right? When the United States, for example, talks about the Indo-Pacific at the moment, it's a much broader region than the traditional Asia Pacific. Among other things, it expands from Australia, from Fiji to East Africa. One focus there is trying to redraw the region in a way that puts China outside of the center. That's the American point of view at the moment. And the Chinese counter is the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to put China in the middle of the world, in particular in terms of trade. But we'll talk about it a little bit later. But when we talk about the Indo-Pacific at the moment, we talk about Asia Pacific. It's, as you can see, a huge part of the world. Now, another very important development I think that we should just at least mention is that I believe that now we're in the Asian century, right? And we're at the moment that this year or last year, the next few years, is the real turning point. Now, when I say the Asian century, of course, I'm talking or I'm referring to the American century, right? The American century is very roughly alluding to Americans' role in the world following the Second World War, where we had one superpower, and we had the Cold War, but generally speaking, this was very much ruled by the United States. And now the idea is that Asia is becoming the leading hub, not only economically, but I think also strategically. When we're talking about the next few years, the next 9 or 10 years, we see that Asian countries will become 40% of the global economy. Asia will generate 6% of global growth, and we'll have another 2.4 billion people added to the global middle class, 90% of them in Asia. So we see that in economic terms, it's already clear, and you can see in this graph that around 2020, the tide has shifted, right? Asia is already the leading, the global economic hub of the world, and that's an interesting development. Now, when we talk about global trade and trade focused on Asia, then I think we should mention RCEP. I'm sure many of you have heard about it, the regional cooperation, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership signed, led by the ASEAN countries, the 10 ASEAN countries, but also joined by China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. India was supposed to join, but left at the last minute. This was signed in November last year, and it will come into effect in a few weeks, in January 2022. And this is, in effect, the biggest world free trade agreement in the world. Now, we'll wait and see how it develops, but I think it has quite a bit of potential to change the economic landscape if things go well. It already represents around 30% of world GDP, and if trade grows, then it will be even more significant. Now, this is important when we're talking about superpower competition in the region, when we're talking about ASEAN's role, we're talking about Southeast Asia, because we see a gap between political statements and the economic reality on the ground. And RCEP, I think, is one clear example of that. And this is something that we should keep in mind. Now, when we're talking about Asia, we should remember that that's, at the moment, the main battlefield, the main region where the superpowers are clashing. Obviously, China is there geographically. It's not going anywhere. The US, as we've heard, especially under Biden, is talking about the pivot to Asia. China has already positioned itself as the leading power in the region economically, for sure, strategically, probably, and now even in recent years, in the last year, we're hearing it more and more, perhaps even militarily. And that's something that we should keep in mind. And Southeast Asia is at the heart of these issues. We see more and more tensions around Asia and around Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan. Just very broadly, I mean, that we know that the Trump administration has been successful in reshaping or changing the dialogue regarding China, but also very effective in damaging the United States relationship with its allies in Asia in general and in Southeast Asia in particular. The Biden administration is looking now for ways to contain China, especially by using, basically by doing two things. One, making sure that it's more present in Asia and in Southeast Asia in particular, and partnering with allied countries like Australia, Japan, and India. I'm sure that you've heard about the Quad. That's Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. And you also might have heard about AUKUS, which is a new alliance between Australia, United States, and the United Kingdom. And in the middle of all of that, you have Southeast Asia as well. So as I mentioned before, Asian countries are generally stuck in the middle. By that, I mean they're stuck between China, which they're dependent on economically, and the United States, which they're generally speaking allied with strategically, although they're different countries with different agendas, especially again in Southeast Asia. Most ASEAN countries and US allies like Japan and India want a US presence in the region, but they definitely want to avoid choosing between China and the United States. We see that obviously as China becomes stronger, these countries are worried about what this could mean for them in terms of policy, but they also have quite a distrusting approach towards the United States and are not sure how committed the US is to the region. We had an attempt by President Obama to come back or to pivot to Asia, and now President Biden is speaking about it, but many countries in the region are not sure about it. And I think, again, when we're talking about the gap between statements and political statements, etc., and the reality on the ground, then RCEP includes China, the ASEAN countries, and all of the US key allies in the region, but not the United States. Same goes for the TPP, or as it's known now as the CPTPP. We have a very significant trade agreement in the region that includes ASEAN countries, other countries, but not the United States. China recently has asked to join the CPTPP. Other countries like Japan and Australia will try to block it, but I actually think that it's likely, or possible at least, that China will join in the end. Australia has taken a pretty extreme or relatively extreme approach when it comes to middle countries, where it basically decided to go all the way with the United States. We saw it with AUKUS, we saw it with the Quad, and that actually puts it in a complicated position vis-a-vis other countries in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, that don't want to be in this position of choosing one side or another. But now let's go into Southeast Asia a little bit in more detail. Again, as I said, Southeast Asia in particular is stuck between the superpowers, and let's talk a little bit about why or how. So generally speaking, the Southeast Asian region has been shaped by superpower competition from the beginning, from the middle of the 20th century, when many of these countries in the region became independent. ASEAN was originally formed by 5 countries, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. With the idea was that Asian countries should join forces rather than face the superpowers by themselves, bilaterally, one by one. They should join forces and create a united bloc that would be non-aligned, would be free, and would be able to navigate between the superpowers. At the time, it was the Soviet Union to a degree, and the United States, and of course China. Since then, especially since the 90s, it's more and more China and the United States that are playing this kind of superpower game. When we're talking about the region itself, right, it's a very diverse region. It's not the countries have different societies, different ruling systems, different economies. You have rich countries, poor countries, democracies, autocracies, kingdoms, etc. You have city-states like Singapore, and you have countries like Indonesia, all fall under Southeast Asia. You have Muslim countries as well, which is interesting. Generally speaking, the population of Southeast Asia is about 640 million people. A lot of the growth that we talked about in terms of population growth and economic growth is in Southeast Asia. So that's why it's a very important region, especially for China. For China, it's definitely its backyard. It has significant economic interest, territorial disputes, the South China Sea. We'll talk about it a little bit later in detail. Yeah, Muhammad? I see a few questions, right? So Muhammad, you want to go first? No? So Abnayahu?
Yes, hello, good evening. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, I see it's also here on the slide about the styles of...
Can you mention your name and maybe a sentence about where you are or why you're interested in Asia?
Yes, of course. Okay, so my name is Benayahu. I grew up in South Israel, in the Negev, and I'm a third-year government diplomacy and strategy student. We have several courses about China as the emerging superpower, what you're talking about. And I'm interested to know about styles of government. How much resemblance do you see nowadays as compared to the Cold War? More like having two major superpowers and having the states sort of choosing between them and falling into spheres of influence. Especially, I'd like to know whether, like, the United States, as having a long history in the region, has accumulated sort of maybe suspicions towards its intentions, whether as like she won't, like you mentioned, she won't deliver and she won't actually help her allies once they're when pressure comes to shove, and also about the style of government, whether communism or capitalism is playing a factor here. And I mean, like, is China actually communist and sort of has that playing in her sort of going for her and helping her.
So that's a great question, a big question, but let me try and break it down a little bit. So first of all, China, US is a little bit different to Soviet Union, United States, because the ideology is a little bit different. And there are questions whether or not China is trying to export its model, right? Does China want all of Southeast Asia to be communist like China is communist or Leninist? I actually think it isn't. What it does want is it wants a region which is stable, which is economically dependent on China, which allows it to continue to grow economically, and it would like, at least ideally, to have less presence from the United States, or what was traditionally a under a US sphere of influence. They would very much like it to be under China's sphere of influence, not necessarily in terms of the system of governance, but rather in terms of economic and strategic dependence and cooperation. That's one thing. I would say that, especially since the 90s, countries, I mean, we had this double kind of process. On the one hand, China has been growing very, very quickly economically, and its relationship with ASEAN countries has become much more developed, much stronger. ASEAN now is the #1 trading bloc, or the #1 trading partner for China, which is something like $750 billion, which is very, very large. They're very dependent on China from their side. It goes both ways. And agreements like RCEP that I mentioned before will make this kind of dependency even greater. The fact that you have all these different systems of government within Southeast Asian nations means that they don't want to have, as I said, they don't want to choose between one system of governance or another. They don't want to be they don't want to be Chinese communists, but they don't necessarily want to be democratic. On the other hand, as I said, on the one hand, we have China growing and becoming more and more influential, and now it's by far, I would say, the number one, definitely economic power, but I would say the number one power in the region. And it's not going anywhere, right? Because of the geographic, because of its geographic position in the region. It's clear, everyone knows that China is there to stay. The United States, on the other hand, has, especially since the 90s, the 2000s, a lot of has been withdrawing from the region, or seen to be withdrawing from the region. We've had countries like the Philippines, like Myanmar, like a few other countries, flip-flopping between the United States, US allies flip-flopping to China, flip-flopping back. A dynamic like that that's changing. You have countries like Singapore, which are definitely doing their best to navigate, to do things with both the United States and China. The general feeling in Southeast Asia is that they definitely cannot count on the United States in a time of need. And this feeling has become stronger over the years. When you have the ASEAN meetings, the ARF meetings, the Southeast Asian countries always complain that the Americans don't take it seriously. They don't usually send a high-level representative. And for example, things like the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was followed very closely by countries in Southeast Asia, because the sense is that when push comes to shove, as you said, the United States cannot be trusted long term. On the other hand, another element of that is that under the Trump administration, a lot of countries felt that the United States, or let's put it this way, a lot of countries in the region felt that it wasn't clear what the United States stands for. And in that sense, China was the more predictable choice, because at least for better or worse, they could understand what China stands for. So that's also an interesting element. Does the fact that China, this is the last point, does the fact that China is communist or so-called communist or communist with Chinese characteristic help China in the region? Depends with who. I mean, Vietnam, who is also communist, is actually developing more and more tensions with China now, and working more with the United States. Singapore, who is, 75% democratic, let's say, is actually more in between. So it really depends on the country. Australia now has changed its tune quite dramatically, but is definitely very much dependent on China economically. So I think it goes both ways, but I think all countries are worried about what it could mean to be completely dependent on China as it becomes stronger. Now I see that I have a few more questions, but I see only one hand. Let's see. Do we have questions in the chat as well? Let me check it. Okay, so we don't have any other questions before I move, before I continue? You can just raise your voice.
Can I maybe add a follow-up question?
Sure. Who's speaking? Just so I can see.
Benayo again.
Okay.
Thank you for your answer. I'd like to ask about nuclear war, let's say. Like, I'm not sure what's the official stance, but I know United States has previously extended the nuclear umbrella over Japan or Taiwan. And I'd like to know, how would that play with
over Japan, not over Japan, not over Taiwan. That's an important point.
Okay.
Japan and South Korea.
Okay, so exactly, what about Russia and North Korea and Pakistan maybe in regards to nuclear power? Like, if we're talking about an Armageddon scenario, who's against who in that region, and who, like, would they expect China to protect them, or maybe the other way around? Would China expect them to participate in maritime warfare.
Good. It looks like I'm drawing. Is that me drawing on my screen? I don't know even how to do it, but I'll try and stop it. No, someone else is drawing. Can you see the drawing or not?
Yes, you could clear all drawing. You have that option on the toolbar somewhere.
Don't see it. Never mind. I'm not even moving my mouse, but you can enjoy some art while I speak.
I'm on it, okay? I will try to remove it.
Okay. Great. So I will try and answer your question. Well, first of all, this kind of scenario is really a doomsday scenario. I don't know if you are. I have someone asking remote control of my screen. Do I want to approve that or not? No. All right. So let's answer the question. Let's answer the question. So my question is, the answer is this. First of all, if you haven't read the book 2034, it's quite interesting because it talks exactly about this kind of scenario where you have the powers, the superpowers, China and the United States, getting into a nuclear war. And actually the interesting actor there that rises, I don't want to spoil it for you, but the interesting actor there is India, that becomes quite a key player. Do I see Pakistan, North Korea, you can maybe add Iran to that, joining forces in some kind of axis against the United States? Not really. Do I see China and the United States having a nuclear war? Again, I think that's very very unlikely. But we'll wait and see. I think what was interesting, I don't know if you've been following this issue, but the issue of hypersonic missiles, right? And the fact that the United States, China recently tested a hypersonic missile that took the United States by surprise. That was quite interesting because for two reasons. One, the United States had no idea that the Chinese have this kind of capability. And two, the fact that they can use this kind of missiles mean that they can actually attack the United States from the other side, right? From the South Pole, which actually means that it could bypass all of the United States defenses. All that being said, and this is all very dramatic, I think that nuclear proliferation is something that actually the United States and China can and should work on together. All right. So let's continue. Just talking about ASEAN, right? As an organization, it was established in 1967. Today it includes 10 nations: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And within these 10 groups, as we said, there's a diversity of cultures, diversity of languages, different economic positions, etc. And it's also interesting to see, well, first it was 5, now it's 10. Okay, again, we talked a little bit about the Cold War. From a Chinese perspective, in 1989, following the Tiananmen Square massacre, China was looking for new friends because it was boycotted by the West. And then it started to focus again or much more in Southeast Asia. Before that, China had a rather disruptive role where it supported anti-government guerrilla forces in Myanmar, Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And this relates, Abnayal, to one of your questions before about the role of China. Its traditional role in the past was quite negative, but that has changed since the 90s, and especially since China became a very powerful economic player. This is again just to give you an idea in the development of the dynamic between China, Southeast Asia, and the United States. So on the one hand, China again is becoming a more and more an economic player. The US engagement with the region is in decline. The US withdrew from the Philippines in 1992, which was a big move. We had the financial crisis in 1997, where China survived it well and helped some of the poorer countries, and that positioned China very well in the region. Following the September 11 attacks, the US renewed its interest in Southeast Asia after what was seen as a withdrawal. And that was focused on the war on terror, right? And trying to fight terrorism. Of course, this was met with mixed feelings, specifically in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. China, as I said, has become gradually the regional leader at the expense of the United States, Japan, who was very much the leader in the 1980s, and Taiwan, who was the leader before China joined the UN. Actually, about Japan, it's a little bit misleading because economically or in terms of aid, Japan is still the biggest donor and the biggest player in the region, but China, I guess, is the most vocal, and the potential, I guess, looking into the future is the clearest. Again, when we're talking about the 2000s, this trend continued. China is becoming more and more powerful. China is also working hard to convince the region and also convince the world that its rise is peaceful. It's interested in a harmonious world. China became ASEAN's leading trade partner in 2008. 2010, the trade was already 300 billion. The end of 2018, it reached 600 billion, right? A 22-fold increase in 15 years. And like I said last year or earlier this year, it was already $750 billion. So when we're talking about a post-COVID world, when we're talking about trade, it's clear that the China-ASEAN relationship is as important as it gets. The United States can't compare on that front. As I mentioned before, the Obama administration, realizing that the US was facing a pretty serious challenge, launched its pivot to Asia. I'm not sure if you remember this, but it wasn't very successful. Trump came in and withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which I think was one of his biggest mistakes. Because that meant, as I said before, that, again, maybe I'll say a few words about the TPP. The TPP was a regional trade agreement, free trade agreement that went from Southeast Asia to South America. And its aim was basically to block China's Belt and Road, or to counter China's Belt and Road initiative to create a US focused free trade agreement. And this was a US initiative, which Trump decided when he became president to withdraw from. So basically, as I said earlier in this discussion, it left the United States out of the two most important regional trade agreements. China is already the #1 or the most important actor in RCEP, and now is trying to become part of the TPP, which was originally designed to block China's rise. So it's quite an interesting, development. When we're talking about ASEAN positions, there's a lot of there's camps within ASEAN when it comes to the United States and China. You have countries like Cambodia, like Laos, that are much more on the China side of things, and countries like, to a degree, let's say Indonesia or Singapore, Thailand, that are more in the US camp. Generally speaking, as I mentioned, ASEAN countries like two things. They like consensus, right? They want to have a consensus agreement between them, and they want to deal with China and to extent with the United States as a group, right? They don't want to deal with them bilaterally because they understand they're much weaker. But that's been a little bit tricky. ASEAN countries prefer a multi-polar world and a multi-power dynamic in the region. They don't want to have one hegemon in the region, and they want to have basically as many options as they can open and play between the different powers, and that could be China, of course, the United States. Now you have the EU is becoming more relevant, and even Russia is rediscovering the region again for the economic reasons that I mentioned. China is obviously and very clearly the economic power, but that also comes with concerns from the ASEAN countries, because it means once China has absolute control, once they're completely dependent on China, what does it mean for ASEAN countries? They're worried about bullying, etc. And just last month in November, we had the China-ASEAN summit, and President Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, went out of his way to try and calm ASEAN fears, specifically saying that China doesn't want to be a hegemon in the region, and China doesn't want to bully small countries, etc. So that's an interesting dynamic. Actually, this more aggressive approach that we see from China in the world today started actually in Southeast Asia. I remember in 2010 when I was in Beijing, then Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi got a bit annoyed in the ASEAN summit when the Singaporean criticized him for the South China Sea, for China's policies in South China Sea. And he basically said to him, listen, China is a very big country. All of you are small countries, and you need to basically do what we say, or you just have to live with the way we see things. And that caused a lot of anxiety on the Chinese side. Now, as tensions grow between the United States and China, China is making quite an effort to ally concerns on ASEAN's side. All right. Any more questions? Yeah, Martin?
I don't know if there was people before me or not, but I'll go ahead and a couple of comments. I'm the old fart in this group. I'm actually from Canada, and so we're very used to sleeping next to elephants.
Yeah.
And as the father of the prime minister, who was a former prime minister, once said, when you sleep next to an elephant, you have to be very concerned with every snort or anything that elephant might do, and you're just a mouse trying to get some sleep next to it. So Canada has a lot of experience sleeping next to elephants. I would ask this about China, but just to get there, my sense is a couple of things. One, China is not a single dynamic, I assume. And we often think of China today as a bit of a dictatorship, call it what you will. That's how they tend to come across. How likely, as the economics change in China, is that likely to continue, or is going to be pushed back? And then secondly, or tied to that, the sense I'm getting is that China is starting to face some real economic challenges with its growth. Even though it's going to continue to grow, it's facing some economic challenges. Finally, Japan seems to be winning out with some Southeast Asian countries when it comes to who's financing what, because China doesn't come with baggage, if you will. And I know I was reading, I think in The Economist, that some people in Vietnam, businesses in Vietnam, felt dealing with Japan was better because China came with far too much luggage. Just comment on that. How is China going to change in the next 10 or 15 years, in your view?
Well, that's the $100 billion question. I think one of the things about China is that it's very hard to predict what it would look like in 5 years, let alone in 10 or 15 years. When I was in Beijing just before Xi Jinping came to power, some people were talking about him as a reformist, right? And he actually went very much in a different direction. And that you asked about whether the economic development of China would lead it to be more open or less of a autocracy. I'm not sure about that. I think that was part of the disillusion that some in the West are experiencing at the moment, because people were saying, I mean, the general American approach or the Western approach was one of engagement, right? The more we engage with China, the more economically development it will become, the more it will become part of the international system, then it will become more like us, right? And that worked to a degree. China reformed its economic infrastructure, became very much more active in the world since the late 70s, but especially under Xi Jinping, it went the other way. So not Western, not democratic, anti-Western, at least in the some interpretation of it. So in that sense, I'm not sure that the current trend shows that China will become less autocratic. But again, when we're talking about China, we need to understand that for, I think, the Communist Party, the most important thing is its own survival and its own legitimacy. And that it gets from, surprisingly, even though it's not a democracy, from the Chinese public, right? So on the one hand, there's no elections, but on the other hand, they do care about what the Chinese public think, and they do need some kind of approval from the Chinese public in order to continue ruling the country, I think just because of the vast size of China. And in the past, people used to say that if China grows less than 8% a year, then it will collapse. Then it will collapse. But now we're talking about 5%, and things are, and still the Communist Party seems to be fairly strong. I think this kind of tension with the United States actually makes its isolationist approach combined with COVID-19 more popular with Chinese people. But again, you mentioned, and I think that's very correct, that China is not one thing. It's a huge country with a lot of different elements to it, a lot of different people, about 1 million people a year, 1 million students a year study overseas in the West, in the West's leading universities, and go back to China. So even if that doesn't mean that China becomes more democratic, I think the influence of the West, or at least this kind of back and forth, is becoming stronger. And that also leads to a separate question that we can discuss maybe later, is whether or not decoupling as a policy is the right move, and which is now the American policy, because is it better for the West to continue engaging with China or not moving forward? Now, what will happen with China in the years to come? It's a very difficult question to answer, but it seems that Xi Jinping as a leader wants to continue ruling for at least another 5 years. One of the things that we see that he's doing is that he's trying to reform some elements of society when it comes to, I mean, anything from computer games to using the tech companies to social media, etc. And to me, just to say one word about it, I think it's about trying to prepare Chinese society culturally to a clash with the West. So take the good things, education, science, technology, and try and move away from the weaknesses of the West. Julio, I think you were waiting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm a student from Italy, and I would like to ask this question. Do you think that possibly the COVID-19 pandemic has stopped the economic growth of China? And more importantly, I would like to ask if you think that the pandemic has changed the way that Western countries and USA sees China, watch China, and relates to her, like in the establishment of new relationship and new partnership with China.
What was the first part of the question?
If you think that COVID-19 has stopped the economic growth of China?
So first of all, I think that in many ways, or in some ways, China has emerged from COVID-19 stronger economically, even more central. I mean, now it's a little bit complicated, but at least initially it dealt with it very quickly and life came back to normal. Now China is the only country that's trying to maintain the zero cases approach, and that means that it will continue to be closed for a while. So that's an issue, but on the other hand, it's very keen to continue trading and to allowing trade as soon as possible. So I don't think it really positioned or made it much weaker, especially when you compare it to the United States and Europe, etc. And that's something that we need to remember, that when it comes to COVID-19 and when it comes to narrative wars, it's comparative. So China can say, you know, we've had COVID-19 has been difficult, but look how badly the United States did and how badly Europe did. And they've been doing that all the time, right? They've been using the way that the West dealt with COVID-19 as a way of making sure that they look better, that China is seen as a winner. And this is domestically and internationally. So in the West, COVID-19 and China's approach, or especially the US criticism of China, has made China maybe look bad, but in other parts of the world, from Asia to the Middle East to Africa, the mood is a little bit different. So again, we need to remember that the world is not, most of the world is not Western, Southeast Asia is not Western, the Middle East is not Western, Africa isn't, and they see things a little bit differently. For many of these countries, China was the first to help when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to vaccines, and especially in the beginning, under Trump, the United States was nowhere to be seen. And that's something I think we should keep in mind. Of course, since Biden came to power, the US has been trying to catch up and doing a lot. But I think the verdict is still out on that. Aina?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am here in I am Aina Baticados from the Philippines. You mentioned earlier that President Xi Jinping mentioned that the China is not being a bully to other countries, but as a citizen of the Philippines, we had been experiencing a lot of their the effects of their actions towards us, especially when it comes to the Spratlys Island situation between the Philippines and China. What can you say about that?
Well, actually, my next part of the lecture, and I'll do it quickly, is about the South China Sea. So we can go in more detail into that, and feel free to jump in. But it's obvious that in the last year or 2 years, China has become much more active, much more aggressive in the South China Sea, and this is with all claimants. The Philippines, I think, is an interesting case because it's been moving in between the superpowers, traditionally a US ally. Your current president decided to move more towards China, and then maybe now moving in the other direction towards the United States. So I think the Philippines is one of the more interesting cases in Southeast Asia when it comes to dealing with the claims in the South China Sea. The question for me, looking from afar, right, because I'm just an observer, is how effective, what is effective when it comes to dealing with China on these territorial issues? Is the Filipino approach effective? Is the Vietnamese approach, which is a little bit aggressive, effective? Is, you know, the Indonesian approach working better? So far, just if I'm being very frank, I don't think any of these approaches are working very well. And that's something that we should keep in mind. But let's talk about it just so other people also understand what we mean. When we're talking about the South China Sea, right? We have it all goes all the way from, well, we have the territorial claims of China, and I have a bit of a better map that I'll show you later. Basically, it's around 2,000 kilometers where China says that it controls the regions all the way to the coast of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia here. This is an area traditionally, I mean, 20 years ago, it wasn't clear exactly what the big deal was about and how serious China is about it. But I think when we look at it now, we should take it and understand it in a much more serious way. It's also one of the regions of the world where an actual military clash, and now you asked about it, could start in the South China Sea between the United States in particular and China. And that's, I think, the most likely scenario is one of miscalculation or mistake. Something is not intended to start a war, but some kind of clash, some kind of freedom of navigation drill that goes well. And I hope that both the United States and China are working to avoid this kind of things. But when we talk about the South China Sea, the motivations for this, the tensions there include nationalism, national integrity, territorial integrity, resources, a lot of energy, a lot of fishing, and I think quite importantly, the superpower competition. Most of these islands are not populated, but are significant because of their location, because of the waterways, because of the energy resources, because of the fishing. The South China Sea is one of the world's busiest waterways. We have, as far as claimants, we have China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Brunei. So many countries, some of them overlapping, right? So some countries are, sometimes you have 3 or 4 countries arguing about the same part of the land, but the main claimant is China, that claims around more than 80% of the land. Vietnam claims sovereignty of the Parcel Islands and Spratly Islands. The Philippines assert ownership over part of the Spratly Islands, and Brunei as well. Brunei and Malaysia also part of the same territory. That's very rough, and we can look at the maps, but just to give you an understanding that it's not a simple situation. Now, while ASEAN countries are trying to handle things between them in a non-aggressive way, China over the last few years, as you mentioned, Aina, is becoming much more active, establishing bases, pushing away fishermen, using this kind of civilian flotillas, which are really more like military vessels, trying to clear some of the areas and assert Chinese control. Again, it's very important mainly because of trade. Most of global shipping passes there. China's oil imports, especially for the Strait of Malacca in Indonesia, are going through. So this is very, very important waters strategically for China and, of course, the other countries in the region. Fisheries, and I think for the Philippines, fisheries is very, very important, is becoming more of an issue. Again, especially in recent years. Now, when it comes to China's position, China has what is called its 9-dash line, right? It's about 2,000 k's stretching all the way, basically almost the whole water body. What happened is, we didn't talk about it in detail, but China has what it calls core interests. Now, traditionally, that used to be Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, right? It's territory, things that are territorially connected. And in recent years, the South China Sea has become one of the leading Chinese core interests, something that China says it will never give up. China has in recent years really creating facts on the ground. So I don't know if you've seen these pictures. I should have brought you one, but you see how in a few years, China has turned little unpopulated islands from, these little rocks to adding more sand and making it, putting a small building to ultimately building airstrips and houses and military bases and having jets landing in some of them as well. As I said here, in 2018, China even deployed missiles on some of the islands. In 2016, I think there was a key ruling by the International Tribunal at The Hague, determining that China's claims have no historic rights, right, over the land. But what happened after that was that there was no follow through. So you mentioned the Philippines. The Philippines soon after that actually moved towards reconciling with China, or not arguing so aggressively about it, which was interesting. And the Chinese in general, I think, feel quite confident that they can resolve, or just by economic force, by other means, push things forwards and ultimately gain control of the whole region. Now, when it comes to the United States in the region, traditionally speaking, of course, it has a lot of security commitment in the regions. Philippines, of course, their former allies, Singapore and Vietnam. Obviously, we mentioned the Malacca Straits. Until last year, or maybe now it's around 18 months, China, the US position was that China and the other claimants should themselves. The US didn't have any official position, but under Trump and now under Biden, the United States officially says that China's claims don't have any validity to them. The US views China's action as really an attempt to push the US out of the region. And I think, as I said before, I think that's also part of the logic from a Chinese perspective. Unfortunately, you have a lot of smaller countries, as we mentioned before, that are paying the consequences. In recent years, we see countries like Britain, like France, like Australia, now we have AUKUS as well, joining the United States in pushing back on China's action in the South China Sea. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that, maybe with Japan, as you mentioned, and India, perhaps not so much in this region, but in Asia more broadly. And I would like to hear what you think about this, but what could be a possible resolution, right? So I mentioned that Southeast Asian nations have traditionally rejected trying to find a bilateral solution. So basically China tells Southeast Asians, guys, we're happy to talk about it, but let's talk about it one-on-one. We don't want to talk about it with the group. Traditionally, ASEAN countries don't want to do that. We've seen countries recently trying to maybe find some kind of a way to make progress bilaterally. Vietnam was one, Philippines was one, each one in a different way, very different way. The bottom line, I think, is that we don't see much progress. None of these approaches for Southeast Asian countries has worked. There is discussion between ASEAN and China on a code of conduct. It has been approved. But again, when we look at the reality on the ground, especially because of superpower competition, China is becoming much more active in deploying military assets in the area, and also much more active in pushing back on Philippines and Vietnamese and other fishing vessels. So making clear that it claims these waters. So that's not a very optimistic note, but I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to open this for more questions and for a discussion.
Can I ask the question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if I'm sort of simplifying what I tried to understand of this lecture, is that these countries are a bit, I'd say they don't like the US conduct of being inconsistent and actually not stating a long-term goal in the region. Like seems like the US has lost its credibility as to whether it's the global policeman or it won't intervene unless it harms what the Chinese call core interest, right? And on the other hand, China seems very clear about its intention, but there seems to be a, not sure this expression works in English, but love-hate relationship between these countries and China. And I wanted to know how sensitive these countries are towards China's image. Possible examples I could bring is the Xinjiang province and the like the re-education camps of the Uyghur minority there, and perhaps other Chinese sort of publicity issues. Also, we had that sexual harassment claim and the missing of the tennis player, right?
Yeah.
Just last week or 2 weeks ago. Like, so how much is China sensitive to its image and actually working on, like you said, Xi Jinping was going out of his way to say that China isn't a bully and she just wants to further the trade and economy in the region. So maybe my question, if I would like to clarify it, is how sensitive is China? What is it doing about it? Are the countries actually tracking this and caring about this, or it's only like a cold calculation of who gives me more? And the other side of the picture is the United States losing points or gaining points in your view in this in the same image field?
Good question again. So first of all, we need to remember that Southeast Asia is not, generally speaking, is not very democratic, right? You have Indonesia, which is a democracy. You have Australia, you have Singapore, but most countries, and especially under COVID, have become less democratic than more democratic, right? So when it comes to issues like human rights, when it comes to issues like Xinjiang, like you mentioned, when it comes to issues like Me Too and all that, then generally speaking, that's not what they care about. So that's not what's going to bother them about China. What would bother them about China would be more about coercion, about, as we heard before, about Chinese taking over territory they believe is theirs, kicking out their fishermen, making them giving them less options. I mean, their goal is to have as much flexibility as possible. Now, as far as trade, I mean, a lot of the prosperity in the region is directly tied to China's rise, right? The United States, even if it wanted to, cannot replace China economically. And that's something that we need to understand. And for many of these countries, in the end of the day, the calculation and life in general is based on economic trade. And yes, the feeling is that the US is on the way out, although I don't know if you've seen this, but the Lowy Institute in Australia has its Asia Power mapping. And this year, for the first time, I think in the last 10 or 13 years, the United States actually overtook, according to them, China in the region. So the US seems to be making some kind of comeback as far as public opinion goes. So that's interesting. And of course, when the Trump administration talks about the pivot to Asia or coming back to Asia or focusing on Asia, Southeast Asia is an important part of that. And the Biden administration is working pretty hard to make sure that the Southeast Asian countries are convinced of the US's presence. Is it working? I'm not sure yet that it's actually working, but that remains to be seen. Komera, you're on mute.
Thank you very much for the conference. I am French. I spent 4 years in Beijing and I was there during the Tiananmen events. Now I am retired. I worked 40 years for the French government in agriculture and research. I heard a recent conference from the Chinese ambassador in Paris. Yeah. He said, China is not aggressive. We are just defending ourselves on the general situation. I wonder if we can believe him, because you talked about the civil boats that are trying to get resources and making influence in Southeast Asia. But as far as I understand, it is not limited to Southeast Asia. We have Chinese boats on the west coast, African coast, on the west South American coast. So it is not limited. So I want to believe. And the second, if you can believe the official discourse of the ambassador. And the second question is, what is the position of Taiwan in this competition in the South Asia Sea, and with the relations with the countries, with the ASEAN countries?
Okay, so
questions.
no problem. Yeah, is China becoming more assertive around the world? I think yes. Southeast Asia, definitely. Other parts of the world, even in the Middle East, you're talking about a first Chinese military base in Djibouti. You're talking about looking at establishing other military bases, especially in Africa. There's always a question what will be in Gwadar in Pakistan. So there are things in that direction for sure, but I don't know if you want to. Again, I'm not taking a position, but for the sake of philosophical argument, how does that compare to other countries' military use? I mean, the Chinese would say, for example, that AUKUS, right, the agreement to give nuclear submarines to Australia, is a very aggressive move towards them. So it's all, and if we're talking about France, then rather than showing unity on the Western side of things, then AUKUS actually showed more division between the Anglo-Saxon countries and France, for example, which has similar interest in Southeast Asia. So again, it's a complicated question, I think, but more than before, I think we can say now that China is becoming, and not only becoming, investing a lot in its military. So I think when it comes to Southeast Asia, China definitely wants to be not only an economic power, but also a military power. Okay, and I think a lot of the discussion we're hearing now about the United States, or let's say this discussion of whether or not the United States is still the #1 military power in Southeast Asia, is in itself a very big psychological victory when it comes to China, or for China. Taiwan is again a complicated question, because most countries in the world, I think now there's Nicaragua just moved from Taiwan to China, so I think now there's 14 countries that recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Many countries, including the United States, including Australia, including Great Britain, including Israel as well, adhere to what is called the One China policy, which means they can make a lot of noise, but in the end, as far as their policy goes, they only accept China, not Taiwan as an independent country. Because of the growing tension between the United States and China, Taiwan has become a big issue. It's also because Xi Jinping seems to think that the reunification, or bringing Taiwan under China's wings, so to speak, is one of the main issues of his legacy. He would like to do that, he says, sooner than later, but what does that mean? Does that mean military? Does that mean economic? He has been sending his jets over the region, not over Taiwanese airspace, but close enough. So the message is clear. I think that's more of a concern for, let's say a direct concern for Japan at the moment. And Japan, we can see over the last year, changing its stance pretty, I was quite surprised to hear how openly the Japanese are talking about this issue and about China in general, and also talking about becoming more active militarily as a general thing. I think obviously if there's a third world war over Taiwan, then that's very bad news for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia in general. They would try and keep out of it as much as they can. They and most of the world. Now, it's a separate question, and maybe for another time, on which countries will join the United States if there is a military conflict over Taiwan. What would Australia do? What would France do? What would other countries do? And also whether or not the United States actually use force when it comes to Taiwan. And maybe we'll finish with this or end with this. Now there's a lot of talk about Russia and the Ukraine. Think about a scenario where you have Russia invading Ukraine and then followed by China invading Taiwan militarily. What would the United States do? I think that's quite an interesting question, because I think it's unlikely that the United States would attack Russia or use military force against Russia and the Ukraine. And then, I mean, they'll use other means, but then what will happen with Taiwan? So that's quite an interesting question to think about. Anything else? Ran out of time?
Just want to make sure that we don't have any more questions. Anyone?
We have Habiba. Habiba.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah. Please.
My question is that are we heading towards a second Cold War between China or US? Or no?
Well, depends who you ask. I think the term Cold War is a bit maybe doesn't suit the situation between China and the United States, especially because, well, we mentioned the ideological issue, but also because China is so integrated in the world as far as trade. Many more countries trade with China than they trade with the United States. And if you add to that the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the Western part of the world is becoming smaller, not bigger. I'm not sure if it's a Cold War. We are, I think, definitely moving towards ongoing superpower competition. The question is, can we manage it? One of the questions I asked recently in an article I wrote was, if we go into this kind of zero-sum game dynamic in Asia, in Southeast Asia, for example, could we have a bit of a less tense dynamic in the Middle East, for example, as a way of avoiding conflict?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Afterman. And thank you so much, everyone who participated. Once again, Dr. Afterman, we would like to thank you for coming and speaking with us today. Sorry about the noise. I got kicked out of the room I was sitting in. It was an honor hearing your personal insights and being able to share your knowledge with us. The event is now officially over. Thank you all for joining us today and in another outstanding event. We will now separate to the breakout rooms. Whoever wants to stay and talk, we'll have another 20 minutes of conversation in the breakout rooms, and then we'll finish this event. If you are not yet an IDI member, feel free to follow us on social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You are more than welcome to join us in order to stay up to date with the IDI attractions and other lectures. And we wish you a good night. We hope to see you all in our next event. And whoever wants can stay to the breakout rooms.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Afterman.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.